In 1991, the best football players in Japan were not footballers, they were employees. They clocked in at companies like Toyota and Mitsubishi, played in stadiums that were basically empty, and then went back to their desks on Monday. Football in Japan wasn't a sport people grew up dreaming about. It was something that happened in the shadow of baseball, which was the real national obsession. 33 years later, that same country beat Germany, beat Spain, and beat England at Wembley, and beat Brazil for the first time in 14 attempts, coming back from 2 goals down to do it. That's not a sports story anymore. That's one of the fastest transformations in the history of any sport, anywhere. So today we're answering the question everyone keeps asking, but nobody fully explains. How does a country with almost no football history, no football culture, and a sport that openly came second, build a team good enough to scare away the biggest nations on earth? The answer involves a businessman who flew to Germany, a coach who refused to panic, and a fan base that, win or lose, leaves every stadium cleaner than they found it. Here's the part that most people don't know. Football actually arrived in Japan early. There are matches on record from the 1880s, but it never had a chance to take root because another sport got there first and never let go. Baseball. Brought over by American influence generations earlier, and by the time football tried to establish itself, baseball already owned the country's imagination. Japan's first organized football league didn't even appear until the 1960s, and it wasn't really a league at all. It was company teams. Toyota had one, Mitsubishi had one, Hitachi had one. The players were full-time employees first and athletes second. Crowds for league matches stayed embarrassingly small. Meanwhile, baseball stadiums were packed. For decades, that was simply the order of things in Japan. Baseball was the main event, and football was the hobby that also happened to be a sport. If you told anyone in that era that this country was going to produce a team capable of beating Germany at the World Cup, they'd have laughed you out the room. But somewhere in the late 1980s, a few people inside Japanese football decided they were done accepting that. The man at the center of it was Saburo Kawaguchi. Years earlier, as a player, he'd actually been part of the Japan team that pulled off a shock win over Argentina at the 1964 Olympics. But it was what he saw on the training trip to Germany that stuck with him. Proper stadiums, proper youth systems, an entire culture built around the sport at every level. Nothing like what existed back home. By the late 1980s, Kawaguchi was in a position to actually do something about it, and what Japan built next wasn't just a new league, it was a complete reset of what football was allowed to mean in that country. In 1993, the J-League launched. 10 teams stripped of their old company names, rebuilt around cities and communities rather than corporations. The opening match drew almost 60,000 fans to Tokyo's National Stadium, and attendances nearly tripled within 2 years. And then they did something almost nobody expected from a brand new domestic league. They went out and signed real stars. Zico, a genuine Brazilian legend, came to play for Kashima Antlers and got nicknamed the God of Soccer. Other World Cup winners and European icons followed. Suddenly Japanese fans, players and kids were watching world-class football in their own backyard for the first time in their lives. 5 years after the J-League launched, Japan qualified for its first ever World Cup in 1998. That's the part that should stop you. 5 years, from a league nobody outside Japan had heard of, to the World Cup stage. But leagues and signings only explain part of it. The other part of this story didn't happen in a stadium, it happened in comic books. In 1981, a manga called Captain Tsubasa started running in Japan. It followed a kid obsessed with becoming a professional footballer in a country at the time barely had a path for that to exist. It became massive. Not football fan massive, but mainstream, household, every kid in the country massive. And here's the part that actually matters for our story. An entire generation of Japanese children picked up a ball because of that comic. Football, for the first time, started competing with baseball in actual school playgrounds. It wasn't just Japanese kids either. Players you definitely heard of, Zinedine Zidane, Fernando Torres, Alessandro Del Piero, have all named that same manga as something that shaped their love of the game. So think about the timeline here. A comic about a kid chasing an impossible dream lands in 1981, and a real professional league launches in 1993. And the kids who grew up idolizing a cartoon footballer were exactly the right age to become the first generation of Japanese players who got to do it for real. Culture didn't just follow the football. In Japan's case, it helped build it. For a long time after 1998, Japan settled into a role the world was comfortable with. Disciplined, organized, good for them, and then politely eliminated. That changed in 2022. Japan walked into the World Cup in Qatar and beat Germany 2-1. A four-time World Cup winner, beat by the team most previews didn't bother taking seriously. Days later, they beat Spain too, 2-1. Two of the most decorated football nations on the planet, beaten in the same group in the same week. And it wasn't a one-off. Since that tournament, Japan beat Germany again, beat Spain again, months before Spain went on to become European champions. They went to Wembley Stadium and became the only Asian nation to ever beat England there. Then right before this World Cup, they did something that had never happened in the country's history. They played Brazil and went 2-0 down. The kind of scoreline that, against Brazil, usually ends the story right there. But Japan came back 3-2, their first win over Brazil in 14 attempts. Their captain, Wataru Endo, didn't downplay it afterward. He told the fans it was time to start talking about lifting the World Cup itself, not the round of 16, the trophy. And they backed it up immediately. They drew 2-2 with the Netherlands at this World Cup, clawing back from behind twice. Then they didn't just beat Tunisia, they demolished them 4-0. A country that didn't have a professional football league until 1993 is now genuinely competing to top a group that includes the Netherlands. That's not an underdog story anymore, that's a power. And it's also worth pointing out, Japan built this super team without their best player even getting on the plane fully healthy. Kaoru Mitoma, the Brighton winger many consider the most talented footballer Japan has ever produced, tore his hamstring before the tournament started. Gone. The same player who scored the winner at Wembley is now out completely. The responsibility landed on Takefusa Kubo, a player who came up through Barcelona's academy as a kid, had to rebuild his career through loan spells when that didn't work out, and is now one of La Liga's most dangerous attackers at Real Sociedad. Mitoma personally messaged Kubo after the injury. Kubo's response: "I want to carry Mitoma's feelings with me and give my all with an even greater sense of responsibility." A country that built its entire football identity from almost nothing in 3 decades didn't fall apart when it lost its best player going into the biggest tournament on earth. It just had the next guy ready. And that's not luck, that's depth, the kind you only get from doing the rebuild properly. But if you ask people why Japan is the story of this World Cup, a lot of them won't even mention a result, they'll mention cleaning. After Japan's opening game against the Netherlands, while most of the stadium emptied out the way stadiums always do, one section didn't move. Japan's fans stayed behind with trash bags, working their way down the rows until their section looked untouched. And nobody told them to. No staff handed out the bags. They've been doing this since their very first World Cup in 1998. The one where they lost every single game, they stayed and cleaned anyway. And there's a Japanese phrase for it, meaning a bird leaves nothing behind. It's something kids are taught in primary school. Clean your own classroom before anyone asks. By the time those kids are adults in a World Cup stadium, it's not a rule, it's just part of who they are. And here's why that detail actually belongs in this video, and it isn't just a nice side story. It's the same instinct that built everything else we just talked about. The same culture that quietly rebuilds a stadium section without being asked is the one that quietly rebuilt an entire footballing nation in 3 decades. A businessman who saw what was missing and fixed it. A generation of kids who picked up a ball because of a comic book. A squad that loses its best player and simply finds the next one. Nothing flashy, no shortcuts, just relentless, repeated effort applied so consistently that eventually the rest of the world has no choice but to notice. So how does a country with zero football culture build a super team? They didn't skip a single step, they built the league, they grew the culture, they produced the players, and 3 decades later, that patience is what's beating Brazil, Germany, and Spain. Most football superpowers were born with the game already in their blood. Japan, however, had to build theirs from a comic book, an empty stadium, and a decision to leave every single place better than they found it.